Go ahead.
Hello everybody, my name is Mark Abbott and I'm here to tell you about EWB's work in the engineering leadership space, to give you an update and to talk about how chapters can get involved this year. So first of all, a little bit of broader context on our work in the engineering leadership space. The history of EWB, so back in 2000 when EWB first got started, one of the founding beliefs was that engineers had more to offer the world of international development than was being expected of them, or even that engineers were expecting of themselves. So from that founding idea, we followed that thread, and it led us to all sorts of exciting and interesting places. It led us to understanding and unlocking this higher potential for engineers in the world of international development. It led us to realize that there were a set of skills and competencies and perspectives that allowed us to unlock this potential. And very quickly on in the history of EWB, we realized as well that it was more than just a higher potential in the world of international development. There was a higher potential of engineers to serve the world more broadly. So when we look at sort of how engineering has been framed and the current sort of mental models and mindsets in engineering that are very rooted in the technical, we foresee the cultural and structural changes that will actually bring an engineering profession that's fully serving society and helping shape the world. To that work, we bring EWB's lenses of social justice and sustainability, and that helps create our focus, which resulted in our work in global engineering. So over the past almost 15 years, EWB's done all sorts of work, most often focused on curriculum changes at universities, on outreach around shaping the message about what engineering is and what it can be. But we've also done a bunch of events along the way, like the Global Engineering Symposium, and we've built up a huge amount of momentum, and that momentum is continuing to build. It's building inside EWB, where we now have 3 strong initiatives that I'm going to talk about in a minute, plus the Change Lab that we've helped to launch. Over the 15 years, we've built a record, a reputation, and relationships in the system, which are putting us in a really interesting space today. Outside, there's also some trends happening that are contributing to this building momentum. We're seeing a critical mass of organizations, initiatives, and leaders that share our general belief in what the engineering profession can be. All this adds up to a big opportunity for the profession and for EWB to play a leading role in helping to unlock this potential. So one way of thinking about it is by thinking about connective tissue. So what we see in the system right now is actually, there's lots of great initiatives and leaders and people that want to make change, but there's a lack of coherence and convergence. And so what we see is with our specific initiatives that we're running, we can role model working with and creating connective tissue in the system that aids that coherence and convergence. And as you'll hear about in a minute, the lab is actually a way to help foster these relationships even on a larger scale. And in general, what we're role modeling as systems change leaders is this concept of a shift of focus from what we are doing in our initiatives to what our initiatives are doing for the system. So we're helping bring that bigger perspective of what's going on in the profession writ large and how each of our initiatives can actually help move the whole profession forward. So that's kind of the broader context in terms of the history of EWB, the opportunity we're seeing right now, and this concept of connective tissue and the role of systems change leaders in helping to drive this level of systems change. Now we're going to flip over and talk a little bit about the specific initiatives and what it can mean for your chapters. So in these initiatives, they somewhat follow sort of a flow, because if you want to change the engineering profession, you have to look at who enters the profession, what the educational experience is like, and then what it's like to work as an engineer and what the opportunities are to drive change. It's not a perfect flow, as you'll see, they kind of overlap, but in general, one of the cool things about our work right now is we actually are working kind of on all of the stages of the life cycle of an engineer. So the first one we'll focus on is Engineers of Tomorrow. So this initiative is basically working to change perceptions and enrollment, so who's going into the profession. And the vehicle that they're using for that is outreach. So outreach to youth, K-12, but also to the general public. And what they're leveraging is networks, EWB's networks, but also other networks. So for example, on National Engineering Month in Ontario this year, which the Engineers of Tomorrow initiative ran on behalf of the Professional Engineers of Ontario, they actually partnered with the Girl Guides as a powerful network to help bring about change in K-12 part of the system with outreach. That's just one example of some of the partnerships they're leveraging in the networks. So leading chapters in this space would be looking at doing multiple outreach events throughout the year, say 6+. During the National Engineering Month in March, we'll be looking at doing 10+ events just in that month alone, and making sure you're doing all the social media to kind of expand that the reach of those events. But That's kind of the backbone of it as the events themselves, the most obvious. And these events don't need to be events that EWB chapters actually plan and host and bring about on their own. It's actually better if we can partner with other organizations and do that, support their event or have them partner with us on our events. And through this process, we want to raise the bar on engineering outreach, creating better messaging and better actual approaches to engage the public. We want to draw on and create new assets so that we're not recreating the wheel all the time, but actually creating a pool of the best outreach and messaging assets possible. And through this, we want to create some cohesion in the storytelling around the profession, so that not just within EWB, but within the broader space, there's actually some coherence to the story we're telling about what the engineering profession is and can be. So on a collective level, what we'd like to see happening is starting to see these local level linkages strengthening. So the linkages between Engineers Without Borders and other groups that are doing outreach and messaging in the engineering profession. And we want to see that starting to actually manifest at a Canada level. So seeing that knitting together of outreach organizations in the engineering space that brings the coherence and convergence and helps us build momentum. So as systems change leaders, one of the cool things you can practice in this space is this concept of connecting and catalyzing efforts in the system far beyond our own, the efforts that we're able to carry out just as EWB. The leader of this initiative is Erica Lee Garcia, and she's about to go on maternity leave, and Alan Ham has taken over leadership for the next period. So that's Engineers of Tomorrow. Then we'll move on to the Global Engineering Initiative. So the Global Engineering Initiative is about creating global engineers. And we believe that global engineers are engineers who are operating at that higher potential. And it's focused, it's rooted at the universities, but it's also targeting professionals and other orgs as well too. And the two main vehicles they're taking is the certificate program and an online learning platform that relates to the certificate but is broader. So leading chapters in this space would get the certificate in place in their school. That's job number one. It's a really tangible and achievable goal. Some of the chapters that have already got the certificate in place or are about to get it in place have demonstrated that if you've got strong relationships with your faculty, you can actually make it happen in 2 to 4 months. And one of the cool things about the certificate is it's really looking at what already exists at the university in order to put the certificate into place. So it's building from what's there as opposed to trying to insert something brand new, which is why this 2 to 4 month period is actually attainable. So a leading chapter would not just have the certificate in place, but have over 10 students enrolled and actually completing the certificate. Collectively, what we'd like to see this year is 15 schools actually having the certificate in place. I believe the latest number is there's 3 that have it right now. And we want to see 150 enrollments by the end of this year. So we're really building momentum so that in future years we can get to have all of the universities having the certificate and numbers like 1,000 students enrolled every year. So the cool thing about, from a systems change leadership perspective and your opportunity to build your systems change leadership skills, is the Global Engineering Certificate and the online platform is work to put in place connective tissue structures. So having a certificate that people can actually look to and has some tangibility around it that defines what a global engineer is and how you can become a global engineer is actually putting in place some of that structural connective tissue. And the leader of this initiative is Patrick Miller, and there's a large team, a distributed team across the chapters as well involved in this one. Next off, we have the Pivot program. So Pivot's about enabling engineers to drive change from within orgs. And not just any change, we're looking at triple bottom line change where you're looking at people, the planet, and profit and how those things can work together. And so the way it actually works is there's a fellowship where we're investing in individual Pivot fellows, but there's also a broadening community of change makers who are trying to drive change from within their organizations. And all of that is adding up to supporting the initiatives that the fellows and the community are actually driving within their organizations. So Pivot is really a reflection of the fact that we can alter who goes into the profession, we can alter sort of the educational and the skills development of engineers. Ultimately, where the rubber hits the road is in the workplaces where we actually have an opportunity to drive change on a larger scale. So leading chapters would be looking at recruiting 5 to 10 fellows from their region, supporting the Pivot fellows with the innovations they come up with. So part of the Pivot fellowship is that they actually come up with an initiative they want to drive within their organization. So the community can support those innovations. And over time, we want to not just support the individual innovations, but create a longer standing enabling community of internal change maker entrepreneurs in organizations. So the collective goals that we're looking at when you add up the contributions of the chapters would be to have 6 innovator workshops across the country this year, with 10 plus pivot fellows per workshop, and some successful initiatives coming out of the work of the fellows, and these regional pivot communities starting to form. So from a systems change leadership point of view, this is the front lines of the engineering leadership efforts. This is where engineers really have a chance to drive impact for society. And if you want to get involved in this one, the initiative leader is Laura Hetherington. So these three are sort of, that we just talked about, the Engineers of Tomorrow, the Global Engineering Initiative, the Pivot Program, are all sort of more traditional initiatives at EWB. Finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about our work in the Engineering Change Lab, which is a little bit different than the other initiatives. Basically, for those of you who were at conference this year, the Engineering Change Lab was launched this past January in the Unite to Unlock conference. And it's meant to be an ongoing platform for collaboration and innovation amongst different actors within the system. So the idea is to connect and support different initiatives, and for EWB, we can really leverage this concept of lab thinking in our work. Because I think one of the really cool things about the way EWB works is there's this reinforcing loop between systems change leadership, so individuals in our community practicing systems change leadership, and how that adds up to systemic innovation. But the more systemic innovation we drive, the more we build our systems change leadership skills. And I think one of the challenges that we and all organizations have is how do you actually take individual acts of leadership and a community of leadership and add up to systemic innovation? And I think one of the cool things for EWB and our work in this space is change labs or social labs are sort of a meta process that allows us to organize our work over time and collaborate with others to add up to systemic innovation. So you can think of the Change Lab work as something that kind of infuses and supports our other initiatives in this space, but also connects us to other organizations and allows us to work with them in true partnership. So leading chapters could be doing stuff around ecosystem mapping, understanding the different initiatives in their area that are doing outreach work, that are doing work on skill development, that are doing work within companies and other parts of the profession, getting an understanding of who those organizations are, what work they're doing, where we align, and how we could work together. And then taking collaborative action. So that collaborative action could be enrolling other organizations to support the existing EWB initiatives. It could be getting involved in some of the lab initiatives that are actually being generated from the lab itself. So the lab consists of 40 organizations that create a microcosm of the engineering profession that get together 3 times a year to actually come up with new ideas or new initiatives to test, very much like EWB initiatives. They're initiatives that are meant to address systemic issues in the profession. And there's, in January, there was an initial list of 7 initiatives that were launched. There's now 9, 2 more were added at the workshop, the second lab workshop that just happened last week. By the time this video gets out there, there'll probably be a post up on MyWB that's sharing all of the output from the second lab workshop. There's an earlier post from back in January you can also read. So you can get a sense of what these lab initiatives are and actually see if there's ways to connect in your chapter's efforts. Or you can look at other efforts that aren't currently within EWB or aren't currently officially lab initiatives, but are neat things that you found through your ecosystem mapping that you think align with EWB's vision of where the profession should go, and start to create relationships around those too. So this idea of collaborative action. And then for the more advanced chapters that really want to kind of take this to the next level, you can actually start to mimic some of the way the lab works on a national scale, which is by bringing together a microcosm of the system and actually in the events that you run, understanding the system in new ways and finding ways to take collaborative action. So for the really advanced chapters who want to kind of get up to the next level, you can look at running an event or even a series of events that actually allow you to sort of understand the system and create these networks. So on a collective goals side, what we want to see with our work in the lab is this connective tissue really starting to form across the profession, lending the coherence and convergence. And in general, it's really about kind of an approach that's very familiar to EWB, working systemically, experimentally, collaboratively. So we want to take that momentum that we've had with EWB's approach in our work and actually help kind of infuse it in the rest of the system and the other organizations we're working with. So from a systems change leadership point of view, the really powerful thing that the lab represents is a shift in thinking from working on the system to working with the system. So for example, for a long time in our curriculum work, in the early days, our mental model was, hey, if we could just convince the dean, then we can make all these changes happen. Turns out when you're actually in the room with the dean and working on the problem together, that they share a lot of the frustrations. And there were barriers there that we weren't perceiving before. So it's an example of how when you can actually get the system in the room with you and work on the problem with them, as opposed to working on them as the problem. It's a really powerful mindset shift that can infuse all of our different work. And so I'm leading the initiative on the Change Lab, and check out the MyWB post, the first lab workshop summary, the second one that's about to go up. And if you're interested in getting involved or learning more about the lab approach, then you can reach out to me. So that's a little bit on the 3 current initiatives: Engineers of Tomorrow with Erica Lee Garcia, Global Engineering Initiative with Patrick Miller, Pivot Program with Laura Hetherington, and sort of this overarching kind of background work on the Engineering Change Lab that I'm leading. And that brings us to, again, back to this sense of building momentum. So there's a lot of amazing work going on inside EWB that builds on 15 years of chapters and leaders within EWB doing some great work and building relationships and reputation. And it's leveraging this momentum that we're seeing building outside, and it's adding up to a big opportunity for all of us this year.
Awesome.